Fog clung to the plantation road like damp cloth, softening hoofbeats and swallowing fence posts. The carriage rolled slowly through it, leather and wood creaking under the weight, lantern light bobbing faintly beneath the axle. On the driver's bench sat a man whose name seldom traveled beyond the stables, a slave whose life was narrow and held by the lines of the road and ruts in the earth. He kept his back straight, eyes ahead, breathing steady, listening to the horse's rhythm and the whisper of wheels over gravel. Inside the carriage, a woman rode alone. She had never done that before. Isaac felt it without looking. The absence of maids pressed heavier than the presence of any passenger ever had. No rustle of skirts behind the curtains, no murmured talk, no clink of perfume bottles, just stillness, the kind that watches. A soft tap sounded against the wooden partition that separated them. "Good morning, Isaac." Her voice drifted through the panel, low and calm, threaded with something he could not name. Mrs. Calderon had owned the plantation barely 3 months, inheriting it when her husband died suddenly of a fever that moved too fast and left almost nothing behind. Black dresses, closed doors, ledgers locked in drawers, a widow's routine performed like ritual. "Morning, ma'am," he answered, tipping his chin but not turning. "You may take the river road today." His hands gripped the reins a little tighter. The river route was longer, muddier, less used. Mist pooled there thick as milk. "Yes, ma'am." The horses shifted as he turned them east. Inside, the widow said nothing more. Isaac tried to tell himself it was normal. It was not. He had driven her almost every morning since she arrived, but always with a maid sitting stiffly beside her, or a basket of errands to justify the trip. Today there was no servant, no parcels, no destination given beyond town. Only the faint scent of lavender drifting through the seams of the carriage door and the weight of unseen eyes on the slope of his shoulders. He had learned early that invisibility was survival. A good driver was quiet. Quiet meant no questions. Quiet meant no stares. Quiet meant being nothing beyond the road. Yet the air behind him pulsed with attention. Fog thickened as the trees leaned inward. Spanish moss hung like drowned lace from the branches. Water birds stirred somewhere unseen. The lantern cast long trembling shadows along the path. After several minutes, the widow spoke again. "How long have you been driving carriages, Isaac?" "Since I was 16, ma'am." "And how old are you now?" He paused a moment too long. 26. 10 years on these roads. Her tone carried idle curiosity, but edges sharpened slightly. "You must know every curve." "Yes, ma'am." Another pause. "Do you ever grow tired of them?" He almost laughed. "Almost." "No, ma'am." The carriage slowed where the road dipped, puddles glimmering under the fog like black glass. A branch scraped the roof. Isaac ducked by habit. Behind him, fabric shifted. He sensed her leaning forward. Widows were not meant to lean toward slaves. The thought struck strange and unwelcome in his chest. "You drive very smoothly," she said. "My husband's coachman used to jolt us half to death." "I try, ma'am." "You succeed." 2 words. Soft. Too close. Silence followed, heavier than before. They passed the river's edge, water barely visible through the haze. Cypress trunks rose like pillars from the marsh. The air smelled of wet leaves and iron. Isaac focused on the horse's ears, the slow plume of steam from their nostrils. Then he felt it. The curtain slid a finger's width aside. He did not turn. He did not need to. Her gaze burned through wool and skin alike. "I dismissed my maid today," she said. His jaw tightened. "Yes, ma'am. I thought I might enjoy the quiet." "Yes, ma'am." Her breath caught faintly. It should not have been heard. It was. The curtain fell back into place. When the carriage reached town outskirts, color returned to the world. Fog thinned. Brick chimneys rose from haze. Market carts lined the streets. Isaac guided the horses toward the square. She did not tell him where to stop right away. Instead, they rolled past shops, past the apothecary, past the church. "Ma'am," he ventured carefully. Slowly, she said. He obeyed. They passed the river dock, planks slick with dew. "Here," she said at last. He brought the horses to a halt. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the door opened. Mrs. Calderon stepped down herself. No maid, no offered arm. She wore black as always, but not the heavy crepe of earlier mornings. This fabric was lighter, clinging to her waist in a way that caught Isaac off guard before he could look elsewhere. A veil hung loose around her shoulders instead of covering her face. She looked younger than he remembered. Or, perhaps, it was closer to him than before. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, eyes on the horse's harness. She lingered. He felt it as pressure between his shoulder blades. Then her gloved hand reached out, not for him, for the carriage door. It brushed his sleeve by accident, leather against wool. Static jumped, a nothing touch, a thunderclap. Her hand froze. So did he. For one suspended breath, the world balanced on that brief touch. Then she withdrew. "I will not be long," she said, turning toward town. Isaac swallowed and watched the road until his pulse slowed. When she returned, she carried no parcels. That unsettled him more than anything. On the ride back, she did not speak, but did not stop watching either. Back at the plantation, servants swarmed the carriage as usual, unloading nothing, asking no questions. Mrs. Calderon descended, nodded once at Isaac, and went inside the big house. He stayed on the bench longer than needed, reins slack in his hands. Morning rides were not meant to feel like storms gathering. That evening, brushing horses, Isaac overheard two maids whispering near the tack room. She rode alone with him. One murmured, "Who is the widow?" Another voice clicked with unease, "That is not proper." Isaac pretended not to hear. The next morning, fog waited again, and the widow climbed into the carriage without a maid. "River Road," she said. His stomach sank. "Yes, ma'am." This time, when the curtain shifted, she did not hide it. Her eyes met the back of his neck, as though she could see straight through bone. Something had begun. He did not yet know what, only that the road ahead had changed. The fog stayed for 3 days. It lingered in pale sheets along the road each morning, rolling in from the river before dawn, clinging stubbornly to the plantation gates, as though the land wanted to keep secrets. Isaac began measuring time not by bells or meals, but by the moment Mrs. Calderon's silhouette appeared on the front steps, black dress cutting through white haze, bonnet tied tight, maids absent, servants noticed. Overseers noticed too, lingering near the stable fence longer than needed, pretending to inspect while watching the carriage roll away. Isaac felt their eyes on his back as clearly as he felt the reins in his hands, but he held his posture, face neutral, gaze straight ahead. Whatever curiosity the widow's routine stirred could not touch him. Inside the carriage, presence replaced sound. Fabric shifted faintly. Springs creaked as she leaned forward, and her slow, careful breathing pressed against him during miles along the river, where cypress knees jutted from dark water, and birds exploded in frantic wings. He listened not to the horses, but to her movements, mapping them with unwanted precision. On the second morning, he brought books. They appeared on the seat beside her, leather-bound and unmarked. Always the same 2 volumes rotated between rides. He recognized them from crates he had once carried into the big house. Ledgers, travel journals, histories of distant places. When she opened them, she did not read in the usual way. Pages rested half-turned, fingers lingering on margins, eyes wandering toward the partition. At one bend where mud sucked at the wheels, Isaac slowed the horses instinctively. The carriage lurched once, enough for her to brace herself. Wood thudded softly. A gloved hand appeared through the narrow speaking hatch, resting longer than balance required. He kept his face forward, shoulders tense beneath the invisible weight of that hand, seconds stretching until the fog seemed to hold its breath with him. By the time they reached town, she withdrew without comment, stepping down unassisted, returning with only a folded scrap of paper tucked into her reticule. On the return ride, the curtain stayed closed, but the silence now felt deliberate rather than accidental, shaped like something waiting to be spoken. Whispers thickened at the plantation. Isaac heard them near the cookhouse, under the shade of the cotton shed, beside water barrels, where women queued with tin pails, pretending not to look. He kept moving, head lowered, hands busy, but fragments drifted anyway. The widow, the driver alone. Every morning. Strange. Even the horses sensed the change. They flicked their ears more frequently. She stamped impatiently at the hitching posts, whenever she came close, nostrils flaring, as if her perfume carried a hidden note under the lavender. On the fourth day, she arrived without a veil. Fog curled around her bare face, pale against the black fabric, eyes shining in a way that startled him before he could look away. The house doors closed behind her, with a hollow F that echoed down the drive. The river road seemed longer than usual, mist so thick that trees faded into gray shapes and water blended into sky. Somewhere deep in the Martian, an alligator bellowed, a low and ancient sound, rippling through the stillness. Isaac kept the horses steady, but a shiver ran through him at the way she shifted repeatedly behind him, as if fighting the urge to lean forward again. Halfway through the ride, something light hit the partition. A folded page slid through the speaking hatch and landed near his knee. At first, he did not touch it. The horses plodded on, hooves muffled in wet earth. The paper stayed where it fell, white against dark wood, a strange brightness in the dim light. When he finally reached for it, fingers closing around it more cautiously than the act required, he tucked it into his coat without opening it. He waited until he was alone in the stable later that afternoon to unfold it. Inside was a single line, written in sharp, slanted script. "You do not belong only to this road." Isaac stared until the letters blurred, then folded the page and slid it into his boot. He told himself it meant nothing. A widow's whim, a careless kindness, a thoughtless thing that could cost him dearly if anyone saw it. That night he dreamed of rivers without banks and roads that stretched into endless white, horses pulling while he tried to decide whether to turn. On the fifth morning, she brought a basket. It rested on the seat beside her, covered with linen. The smell reached him immediately. Bread, fresh, still warm. She left it behind when she stepped into town. He waited until she was gone before lifting the cloth. 2 rolls, butter wrapped in paper, a small wedge of cheese. Food from the big house almost never reached the stables unless something was wrong. He did not eat it. Not then. He hid it beneath straw and returned to brushing the horses, hands trembling just enough to annoy him. That evening he split the bread with an older groom who had taught him harness repair years ago, saying nothing about its origin. He did not keep the cheese. Keeping things from her felt safer. The next morning the fog finally lifted. Sunlight poured across the road, revealing every rut and puddle, every stretch of riverbank. Isaac almost welcomed the clarity, until he realized it made them visible. Anyone could watch them now, from the fields, the tree line, the fence posts where crows perched like old sentinels. Mrs. Calderon seemed to sense it too. She kept the curtain shut the whole ride, moving only in tiny, cautious shifts, as if making herself smaller for unseen eyes. Yet when they reached town, she did not get out immediately. The door opened halfway. She paused. Then she stepped out and handed him something small wrapped in cloth. A book, thin, worn. The cover rubbed smooth. He took it before thinking better of it. That night, by lantern light in his quarters, he opened it. Inside the front cover, beneath an old owner's scratched-out name, a line had been added in fresh ink. "Read where the margins speak." Isaac closed the book slowly. Outside, the plantation hummed with insects and distant frogs, but inside his chest, something began to knock, steady and insistent, like a second heart testing itself. The widow had not touched him again, had not said anything dangerous, but the road between them was narrowing, and he could feel it. The reins were no longer the only thing pulling him forward. By the 6th morning, Isaac understood that the rides were no longer mere errands. They were arrangements. The realization crept over him as he stood in the stable before dawn, buckling supple leather straps, running his hands over harness rings that did not need polishing, stalling without knowing why. The carriage. Lanterns burned lower than usual, glass clouded by last night's insects, and the horses snorted, restless, as though sensing the same tension lodged in his chest. When Mrs. Calderon appeared on the steps, the household was awake enough to notice. 2 maids hovered near the doorway with folded shawls, unsure whether to follow. An overseer lingered at the base of the stairs, pretending to examine a loose stone. The widow descended alone anyway, gloved hands folded at her waist, black skirts whispering against each other as she passed the onlookers and climbed into the carriage without looking back. Isaac did not look back either. The wheels rolled. The river road received them with a pale glint of water through reeds and a wind sharper than any fog. Sunlight filtered through branches in thin gold stripes, marking every motion too plainly. He drove carefully, not from concern for her safety, but knowing that even a small jolt might draw eyes that should not linger. Inside, the curtain shifted. She did not pull it aside. She tapped the partition softly. He kept his face forward. After long minutes, something warm brushed his calf. Not cloth, skin. He froze. The horses continued at their measured pace, unaware that the world had tilted. Her foot had slipped through the speaking hatch, thin ankle pale against dark wood. It stayed there, resting close enough for him to feel heat in the air. He did not breathe until it withdrew. The curtain fell back. Nothing else happened on the ride. Everything happened in town. She bought nothing, walked the square, spoke briefly to the banker, returned to the carriage composed, empty-handed. On the road back, the curtain stayed closed. But Isaac knew now that concealment was a choice, a deliberate game. At the plantation, she left a second book. He did not wait until night this time. He opened it in the tack room, while the horses drank, heart thudding. The margins were filled with neat angled notes, some about the text, others observations beyond it. The river curves because it must. Roads change only when driven differently. Freedom is sometimes a matter of direction. He shut it. A groom passed. Isaac slid it under a saddle, pretending to check girths until footsteps faded. Over the next week, the rides became deliberate. She varied her clothing, lighter blacks, charcoal grays, once deep blue under a morning cloak. She brought no maids, no baskets, no parcels, but always a book, always a reason to keep the curtain half drawn. Her movements inside grew bolder, a knee briefly through the hatch, fingers resting along the partition where his elbow might brush, breath close enough to smell tea and citrus under lavender. Isaac responded with extreme caution, driving straighter, sitting rigidly, speaking only when necessary, avoiding even the slightest glance. The plantation's eyes felt like insects crawling over his skin whenever the carriage rolled out. One afternoon, returning earlier than usual, he was summoned to the big house. His stomach hollowed. He scrubbed at the pump, straightened his coat, and followed a maid through polished corridors thick with curtains. Mrs. Calderon waited in a small parlor near the back. Sunlight spilled through tall windows onto a desk scattered with papers. The maid withdrew. Isaac stood near the door. She did not rise. She gestured to a chair. He did not sit. For several heartbeats, she watched him, calm, assessing, sharp with focus that made his skin prickle. She spoke quietly about horses, schedules, routes, necessary words, safe words. Then she dismissed him. He turned, but she stopped him with one sentence. "You read, not a question." He paused. "Yes, ma'am." Her gaze lingered longer than propriety allowed. That evening he found a scrap tucked in the book beneath high S mattress. Tomorrow, longer ride. The next morning was bright and merciless. No fog, no hiding. She boarded with only a small reticule. The river road stretched ahead, every bend exposed. Isaac guided the horses with steadier hands than his chest. Miles passed. No one followed. The plantation disappeared behind trees. When the road curved into a stand of cypress dense enough to dim the light, the carriage slowed. Movement. The curtain slid back. Her face appeared closer than ever. Eyes intent, mouth composed yet softened at the edges by something dangerous. She did not speak. She only looked. Isaac swallowed, kept his gaze on the road. Then she reached through the hatch, gloved fingers lightly resting on his wrist. He flinched despite himself. The horses kept walking. The world did not end. Her touch remained. A quiet claim no one else could see. The reins trembled. The river whispered beside them. Something circling for days finally closed the gap. Neither moved away. The touch did not last long. It did. Isaac carried it with him all through the day like a warmth beneath his skin, the faint pressure of her gloved fingers lingering far longer than the moment she withdrew her hand and drew the curtain shut again. The horses pushed on, through slanted light and shadow hooves breaking the river's smooth reflection while his thoughts splintered into careful pieces. Control the rhythm. Watch the road. Keep shoulders straight. Do not turn. The plantation gates swallowed them when they returned. Servants scattered quickly to clear the way, eyes flicking over him before darting toward the carriage door. Mrs. Calderon stepped down with perfect calm, nodded once at the stable boy who held the step-stool too late, and moved inside the house without another glance at Isaac. That night he did not open any books. He left them stacked under his cot and stared at the ceiling beams until the insects hushed and the river wind crept through cracks in the boards, tracing cold fingers along his neck. He reminded himself what he had been telling himself since the first morning she rode alone. This is nothing. This is danger masked as courtesy. This is not for him to want. The next morning came too fast. She appeared dressed in charcoal rather than black bonnet, trimmed with dull ribbon, not crepe gloves the shade of cream. The subtle changes struck him more sharply than any words could. No maids, followed no overseer, pretended to check the harness, but Isaac felt eyes anyway hidden behind shutters, porch columns, and the slow steps of gardeners who lingered too long beside hedges. They took the river road again. The morning was bright mist only clinging in the low areas curling along water, like faint breath. Isaac kept the horses to a careful walk, every muscle held in restraint. The carriage was quiet, until they passed a half-submerged fallen tree in the marsh, its bark smoothed by floods. The curtain slid back. Her face was closer than yesterday, no veil, hair pinned neatly at her temples. She did not touch him. This time she watched him the way one might inspect a lock before choosing a key. When the curtain fell, he exhaled, slowly realizing he had been holding his breath far too long. In town, she lingered longer than usual, talking to shopkeepers, circling the square twice, pausing near the river docks where crates stacked like small buildings. Isaac waited beside the horse's hat, low senses stretched thin. When she returned, her reticule felt heavier. On the way back, the carriage slowed on its own. He had not told the horses to ease. He corrected them immediately, pulse spiking. At the realization his body had begun making choices his mind had not allowed. They passed a narrow side path where reeds bent inward, hiding a muddy trail that disappeared into trees. A stone tapped the inside of the petition. He did not answer. Another tap. When he looked back, he saw only the curtain edge fluttering closed. The horses slowed again. This time he let them go. The side path waited. He took it. The turn was slight. Anyone watching from afar might think it was part of the river road. Trees closed around them quickly, leaves muting sound branches, arching overhead, forming a tunnel of green and shadow. Water trickled somewhere unseen. The air cooled. He brought the carriage to a stop where the track widened, enough to hide marks under fallen needles. Silence settled behind him. Came the softest breath. The door opened. Mrs. Calderon stepped down onto leaf litter, without help, skirts brushing damp earth. She lingered beside the carriage for a moment, looking around, memorizing angles, listening. Then she moved closer to the driver's seat. Isaac stayed seated, hands still on the reins, though the horses had stilled. She reached up, not for the reins, but for him. Her bare fingers slid between glove and cuff at his wrist, cool and deliberate. He did not pull away, could not. The world narrowed to that touch. She said nothing at first. Neither did he. Words were too big for what hovered between them. When she finally lifted her hand, she pressed something into his palm, a folded slip of paper. He closed his fingers around it instinctively. She stepped back, returned to the carriage door shut. He did not open it until night. It had only an address written neatly, a boathouse near the old ferry landing. Below it, a time before dawn, Isaac folded it until the creases widened. The next morning he could not sleep. He stood by the river long after chores, watching moonlight fracture on black water, listening to frogs, insects distant, owls, telling himself curiosity was not consent, fear not desire. Before dawn he took the carriage alone. No lantern, no groom. He drove to the ferry landing. The boathouse crouched at the water's edge, roof sagging, doors half up, and river mist curling inside like breath. Mrs. Calderon waited in shadow. She wore a simple cloak over a plain dress, no jewelry, hair pinned tight, not in widow's attire. Just a woman. Isaac stopped the horses, got down the space between them. Thrummed like wire, she stepped forward first, Hand brushed his sleeve, then chest, then rested there. He did not move. She tilted her face up. The kiss was not sudden. It was careful, testing a question without words. He answered. When they broke, apart the river flowed as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. From the boathouse rafters water dripped steadily into a skiff, counting seconds they no longer had. When they parted, she touched his cheek lightly as if memorizing it, then stepped back into shadow. They returned to the plantation separately. By daylight, by routine, by roles, but something had shifted a line the road could never uncurl. Isaac knew with aching clarity the morning rides would never feel ordinary again. After the boathouse mornings changed not outwardly. Carriage still rolled through gates at the same hour, hoof-striking gravel lanterns swinging beneath the axle. When dawn lagged, Mrs. Calderon wore dark dresses, rode without maids, requested the river road with composed tilt of her head, suggesting nothing more. Yet everything inside that small wooden box had shifted. Silence no longer empty. Isaac sensed her before curtain moved, could trace her posture by creak of springs, faint rasp of fabric, sometimes caught her reflection in brass fittings near the hatch, pale blur where a face should not. Sometimes carriage slowed because he wished it, not because horse tired. They did not meet for 3 days. That restraint felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though danger was allowed to cool. Before stoking, Isaac focused on work with near obsession, volunteering for extra harness repairs, taking longer routes, fetching feed, scrubbing mud from already clean wheel. Grooms noticed his restlessness. One asked if Widow had been hard on him. He said nothing. On the 4th day she brushed his hand, not gloved. Bare it happened when she stepped down in town, fingers grazing his knuckles as she steadied on. Carriage rail. Contact lasted less than a heartbeat, left him shaking. She returned with parcels that day, baskets, wrapped boxes, making ride seem respectable. But when she left one behind by accident, he found only folded cloth and a second note. Tomorrow, after he burned it in the stable lantern. The next evening, after yard went quiet, last lanterns winked out in slave quarters, Isaac slipped to river path skirting cotton fields. Moon hung low, water silver. Boathouse darker, doors gaping, like mouth. She waited inside. This time she did not hesitate. She closed distance hands, finding his coat shoulders, gripping fabric as if afraid he might vanish. Kiss deepened, no longer tentative heat cutting through weeks of restraint. His hands hovered, then settled at her waist, feeling rigid whalebone beneath dress, fragile reality of her body against his. They spoke little, did not need to. River whispered enough. Later, when daylight danger crept closer, she rested forehead against his. Chest long moment, then stepped back, smoothing skirts, rearranging hair with efficient movements, not fully hiding blush. They returned separately. By habit, by fear, rides grew more charged. Her foot brushed his calf more often. Fingers slipped through hatch, touching his wrist for seconds. Once road jolted, she caught his shoulder to steady herself, not releasing until horses had walked a dozen paces. Plantation responded. Overseer began appearing near gates each morning, eyes following. Carriage until it vanished into trees. Servants lingered on porches longer. Mrs. Calderon's relatives arrived in carriages, staying overnight, whispering in parlors with doors half closed. One evening, Isaac found latch on his qua. Raters loosened. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed, just warning shaped like coincidence. At next meeting, she brought news without speaking, pressed folded scrap of paper into his hand as he helped her down from carriage. They are watching. He crushed it in fist, dropped it into puddle before anyone could see. That night at the boathouse, she seemed even sterner than before. Her hair was pinned tighter, the cloak wrapped closer around her shoulders. She cupped his face in her hands as if trying to memorize every line, every shadow. They did not linger. They could not afford to. He wanted to tell her to stop. He did not. Instead, he kissed her more fiercely than before, as though the intensity could somehow replace caution. When they finally pulled apart, the river wind cut sharp and cold through the damp reeds, carrying faint voices from the distant plantation. She glanced back once before melting into the shadows. He remained standing, watching long after she vanished. The next morning she rode with the carriage curtain drawn shut. No hands brushed, no notes passed, only a deliberate absence. That absence unsettled him more than any bold gesture had ever done. 3 days passed in silence and distance. On the fourth, she boarded the carriage looking pale, gloves missing, her hands folded in her lap, almost visible through the small hatch. Halfway along the river road, she pressed 2 fingers lightly against the wood between them. She did not touch him, merely rested them there. A quiet claim, a signal, a promise. Something was coming. Isaac did not know what shape it would take, only that the road ahead had become razor-thin, and they were walking its edge together. By the 6th week, the mornings carried a tension heavier than the mist rolling off the river. The carriage no longer felt like a simple conveyance from the plantation to town. Each turn, each sway of the bench, every soft clink of the harness rang like a warning. Isaac sensed it in the restless horses beneath him, ears flicking toward unseen dangers. The river road stretched ahead in its usual quiet calm, but its curves and marshes hid more than water. They hid consequences. She arrived, as always, alone, her black dress lighter in the fabric yet still somber, gloves abandoned for the first time in weeks, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The air around her smelled of tea and citrus, but now there was a sharper note, an urgency almost imperceptible, as if she had run through shadowed halls before stepping into the carriage. Her eyes were alert, scanning trees, fields, and horizon, measuring everything and everyone. Even her posture, normally composed and precise, hinted at tension. A slight tremor in her shoulders, a flutter in the edge of her skirt. Isaac noticed instantly, chest tightening under the reins. He had come to know her moods like he knew the river's bends, subtle, yet impossible to ignore. The river road welcomed them with its familiar serene calm. Today, however, the water mirrored the sky perfectly, silver and still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Isaac drove carefully, hands steady, senses alert. The partition between them shivered as she leaned forward slightly, a movement registering through the thin wood. No words passed, none were needed. The air trembled with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Every glance, every breath was heavy with risk. By the time they reached town, the plantation's unseen eyes would already be tracing their path, like predators waiting at the edge of a clearing. As the carriage passed the river docks, she pressed a folded piece of paper into his palm without a word. He did not open it immediately, clutching it beneath his coat, fingertips stretching to hold it tight. His heart hammered, awareness sharpening. The note required no explanation. Its meaning was unmistakable. Plans, warnings, instructions, a preparation for something larger, something neither of them could yet name. The river whispered against the reeds as the horses carried them back to the plantation, with the measured rhythm of weeks past. Each hoofbeat drew him deeper into the invisible current binding him to her. That evening, in the dim light of the tack room, Isaac unfolded the note. The ink was precise, neat, and careful. It described a meeting near the old ferry landing before dawn, when the fog would be thick enough to hide everything. At the bottom, in a smaller, almost intimate hand, one line made his blood run cold. Be ready for more than words. He understood immediately, though he refused to speak it even to himself. Desire and danger were converging, and the river road was no longer a simple path. It had become a crucible. The following morning, dawn barely kissing the horizon, he guided the horses along the familiar route. Every snap of a twig, distant bird call, and flapping branch tightened his pulse. The boathouse emerged from the mist like a ghost, shadowed and empty, doors hanging slightly ajar. She stood inside, cloak wrapped tightly, hair pinned with careful precision. Her pale face in the soft morning light was grave but resolute. The air between them hummed with unspoken intent, each second stretching unbearably long. She stepped forward without hesitation, and this time he did not resist. Hands found each other, glances lingered, breaths mingled in the tight confines of the boathouse. The kiss was no longer tentative. It carried the weight of stolen weeks, risk, and longing. When she pulled back, she rested her forehead against his chest, the warmth grounding him even as fear coiled tight in his stomach. The river outside whispered, as if acknowledging the gravity of what had begun in shadow and fog. When they returned to the plantation, reality settled over Isaac, like cold stone. Eyes watched. Whispers drifted. Danger felt closer than ever. Yet beneath the threat, a seed of something irreversible had taken root. The rides, once routine, had become reckoning. Every dawn held possibility and peril, intimacy and exposure, balanced on the razor's edge between desire and survival. Isaac understood clearly, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that once this path had begun, there was no turning back. The mornings no longer carried the fragile rhythm of past weeks. Each ride felt like a tightrope stretched over a river with no bottom, and the fog that had softened edges now warned of unseen peril. Isaac guided the carriage, with hands steady, chest tight with tension no repetition could ease. The horses mirrored him, ears twitching at shadows that had no name. Even the river, once a silent companion, glimmered sharp and cold, reflecting the danger surrounding them. She arrived alone, as always, but her presence weighed heavier than cloth. Each measured step seemed to echo beyond the carriage, gloves abandoned, hands folded neatly in her lap. Control radiated from her even as her gaze flicked to the tree line, scanning for eyes following them from the plantation. The air vibrated with unspoken urgency. The boundaries they had skirted for weeks were no longer mere suggestions. They were threats. Each ride was a negotiation between desire and survival. The river road had never felt sharper. Its bends hid nothing. Mist, once an ally, had been replaced by exposure. Isaac drove with care, conscious of ever why sound. The leather creak, the carriage sway, the subtle shift of her weight. She leaned forward once, hair brushing his sleeve, heat and closeness surging through him. His hands clenched the reins, knuckles widening as the world outside maintained deceptive calm. Halfway along the ride, she pressed a folded note into his palm. His pulse raced. He did not open it immediately, holding it close to his chest, as if the act could shield them from whatever consequences awaited. Every mile back to the plantation was a tense stretch of anticipation, sunlight casting sharp shadows along the path. Their return drew attention, as always, but Isaac remained stoic. The world had begun to notice the rhythm forming between them, the silent language of glances and touches beyond interpretation. That evening, under dim lantern light in the boathouse, he unfolded the note. Ink, deliberate and precise. It gave a time, a place, and instructions for secrecy. At the bottom, one line burned like a whisper. Tonight, nothing is safe. Isaac's stomach twisted. The note was a warning, a promise, an invitation, all at once. Whatever awaited him would change everything. When he arrived at the boathouse that night, fog lay thick from the river. She was already there, standing in shadow, hair neatly pinned, cloak drawn tight. She stepped forward as he entered, hands finding his coat, gripping him like an anchor. The kiss that followed was fierce, no longer exploratory, heavy with weeks of restraint, longing, and danger. When it ended, she rested her forehead against his chest, breathing steady but deep, and Isaac felt the undeniable truth of their bond settle over him. The night stretched long and silent, river water lapping softly, the boathouse a single solemn witness. Every heartbeat reminded him that desire could no longer exist alone. It came bound to risk and consequence. With every stolen touch, every lingering glance, every carefully measured pause, the world beyond them felt smaller, sharper, and more threatening. When they finally separated, each returning to the plantation on their own, the tension stayed, coiled and ready, refusing to be released. By morning, Isaac could sense the shift in the air. Something had started that could not be undone. The plantation seemed to watch him more closely, every shadow and whisper carrying suspicion. Voices murmured along the hallways. Eyes followed the carriage as it moved along the river road. Even the horses seemed aware, as if they understood that their routine had become something more than mere work. Every step, every mile, every quiet moment now held the weight of choices neither could take back. The line between longing and danger had vanished, and Isaac realized with cold precision that nothing would ever be simple again. The river road had claimed them both, and it demanded everything. By the time early spring touched the fields, the river road had become both lifeline and prison. Each morning, Isaac guided the carriage along its winding path, with steady hands and a taut heart, knowing every mile carried more than a widow and her driver. It carried consequence. Every glance, every brush of skin, every silent breath in the enclosed carriage felt charged with meaning. The plantation's gaze, always vigilant, had sharpened into suspicion. Rumors flickered among the servants like dangerous candle flames, unpredictable and persistent, while somewhere beneath it all, the inevitability of what was coming took root. The mornings became a careful ritual. She arrived alone, her black skirt softened into charcoal, her gloves absent, hands resting lightly in her lap, her eyes no longer just. T scanned the trees or river. They tracked him, studied him, measured the distance between them with unflinching precision. Isaac noticed immediately the shift, the way her gaze lingered on his hands, on his jawline, on the line of his shoulders. Each ride was no longer just travel. It became assessment, a testing of fragile boundaries between desire, danger, and the quiet life they were building. He drove with a precision that bordered on obsession, keeping the horses steady while his pulse raced beneath the rein. 2 weeks later, the consequences of their secret meetings began to appear in small, undeniable ways. One morning, she left a folded note in his hand, hidden beneath the petition. There were no words of longing or intimacy. Instead, the note carried sharp news, stark as a blade. She was with child. Isaac's grip on the reins tightened, knuckles whitening as the horses nudged at his hesitation. He felt the weight of it, even before opening the note fully, the impossible, dangerous reality of what her body now carried and what it meant for both of them. The plantation's scrutiny, already suffocating, would intensify. The river road, once a refuge, could become a gauntlet. That evening at the boathouse, the air between them had shifted. The river whispered low, mournful tones, shadows draping the walls in almost accusing patterns. She reached for him first, hands finding his with urgent deliberation, but her eyes held fear. The kiss that followed was fierce, desperate, and tinged with worry. Every touch had to be measured. Every movement weighed against the invisible eyes of the outside world. Isaac could feel the enormity of the risk pressing against his chest, like a heavy stone. The child she carried made secrecy nearly impossible, yet leaving her alone was unimaginable. In the following days, the plantation responded subtly but unmistakably. Overseers lingered longer at the gates, neighbors whispered behind shutters, and even routine work in the stables carried the sense of being watched. Isaac navigated the carriage with intense care, knowing that every mile, every turn, every pause could be seen and judged. The river road, once a hidden path of intimacy, had become a stage, and they were performers in a drama whose consequences stretched far beyond desire. Despite the danger, their bond grew more urgent, more consuming. Morning rides became acts of quiet defiance. Fleeting moments of contact burned into memory. She pressed her hand to the petition. He brushed it lightly with a thumb, anchoring himself. A glance, a breath, a subtle shift in posture spoke more than words ever could. And throughout it all, the quiet pulse of new life remained, unspoken, a promise both beautiful and terrifying. By the week's end, Isaac understood the impossibility of their situation fully. Desire, danger, and responsibility had intertwined in ways that could not be separated. Each ride carried them further into risk. Each meeting demanded more courage than either possessed, and the plantation, always watchful, would not forgive mistakes. And yet, despite everything, he could not imagine a day without her presence, a journey without the rhythm of hooves and the warmth of her hand pressed through the narrow partition. The river road had changed them forever. It had made them desperate, daring, and inseparably entwined. As the sun set behind the distant cypress trees, Isaac realized with chilling clarity that nothing would ever be simple again. The rides, the kisses, the whispers of fog and river had set a chain of consequences into motion that would touch everything they cared about. The child she carried made retreat impossible. The danger, the passion, the stakes, they had all grown too great to ignore. This was no longer just a journey. It was a reckoning.